Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Martin Van Buren, and the focus is Presidential Travails. The year is 1837, it's March 4th, Inauguration Day, and Van Buren is being sworn in as the 8th President of the United States in what was undoubtedly the happiest day of his presidency, because there weren't very many happy days after this one. And the reason was really singular. It was the same reason he got elected: his strict adherence to the policies of his predecessor, Andrew Jackson. Well, Jackson actually was the focal point of attention on Van Buren's Inauguration Day as more people came to say goodbye to the old general who was leaving public service after 8 years in the presidency, still revered by so many, including his successor. In his inaugural address, Van Buren made the comment that, "United as I have been in his councils, a daily witness of his exclusive and unsurpassed devotion to his country's welfare, agreeing with him in sentiments which his countrymen have warmly supported, and permitted to partake largely of his confidence, I may hope that somewhat of the same cheering approbation will be found to attend upon my path." I'm going to stick with Jackson's policies, and hopefully that will bode well for the future. The fact is, it did not, but that would play out over the next 4 years. As far as his own presidential philosophy, in his inaugural remarks, Van Buren said a strict adherence to the letter and spirit of the Constitution, viewing it as limited to national objects, regarding it as leaving to the people and the states all power not explicitly parted with, very similar to a Jacksonian or Jeffersonian kind of perspective. Van Buren was also very aware that not a lot of presidents actually enjoyed the job. It was a difficult job, and frankly, more negative experiences when you're in the seat than positive ones. And Van Buren had his eyes wide open going in. He said at the time that whilst to have been deemed worthy by a majority of the people of the United States to fill the office of the Chief Magistrate of the Republic is an honor which ought to satisfy the aspirations of the most ambitious citizen. The period of his actual possession of its powers and performance of his duties is and must, from the nature of things, always be, to a right-minded man, one of toilsome and anxious probation. It was a tough job. He knew it. He was going to do the best he could, sticking with those Jackson policies. Well, he did have some help. His senior advisors in the cabinet, he decided to retain most of Jackson's cabinet members. After all, he was going to continue the policies. Why not continue with his advisors that he knew extremely well? In terms of his own presidential staff, well, that was basically one person. Like his predecessors, he found a job for a relative as his private secretary. It usually had been like a nephew or his son. That was the case for Van Buren, who asked his son Abraham to step in as his staff secretary. And his wife, Abraham's wife, Angelica, played the role of First Lady for social functions and official duties in that capacity, given that Van Buren's own wife had died many years before. Well, just a couple of months into the Van Buren administration, sure enough, the economic recession hit, and it hit hard. The worst since the founding of the Republic, a lot of it having to do with the policies from Andrew Jackson's presidency, when he basically shut down the Bank of the United States, removed the federal funds, put them in state banks. Those banks started venturing into some over-speculation, and then that specie circular that Jackson had passed, where it said only hard currency, specie, gold and silver, could be used in transactions on public land sales with the federal government. Well, there wasn't enough specie in the country to deal with this. There were run-on banks, the over-speculation hit, and all of a sudden, the economy went in the tank. What did Martin Van Buren do? Well, he realized what was going on, and he decided to call into special session Congress to come back from its recess, and they were to arrive in the first week of September to try to deal with this economic collapse. But Van Buren was clear. He thought the federal government had a very limited role when it came to economic issues such as this one. It was somewhat of a tough love speech that he gave when the special session of Congress opened. Van Buren said, "Those who look to the action of this government for specific aid to the citizen to relieve embarrassments arising from losses by revulsions in commerce and credit lose sight of the ends for which it was created and the powers with which it is clothed. All communities are apt to look to government for too much. We are prone to do so especially at periods of sudden embarrassment and distress. The less government interferes with private pursuits, the better for the general prosperity. It is not its legitimate object to make men rich or to repair by direct grants of money or legislation in favor of particular pursuits losses not incurred in the public service. He was not for intervention by the federal government. If there was suffering in the economy, it had to play itself out. If there had been overspeculation, it had to play itself out, root out the bad apples, and eventually the economy would come back. And of course, along the way, he was not saying anything about the policies of Andrew Jackson contributing to this, and he was not going to reverse any of those either. Again, a tough love address from President Martin Van Buren. He would not consider some positions that he go back on some of those Jackson policies, like to recharter the Bank of the U.S. or to put funds back in that bank. He would never countenance that idea, but he did have a solution. He didn't see the state banks as the right answer either, given their over-speculation that had contributed to the recent recession. He thought that the government should manage its own funds, independent of the banking system. He called it a Sub-Treasury proposal, where the Treasury Department would establish a new unit in which the government's funds would be effectively put into vaults owned and managed and operated by the Treasury Department, by government employees, and again, keep it independent of the banking system. Well, he actually got some tractions for this in the United States Senate, but the House of Representatives continued to balk throughout most of his 4 years in office. He kept trying, and in his last year of this administration in 1840, sure enough, the House and Senate both passed the Sub-Treasury into law. He signed it into law, but it was never implemented on his watch, and his successor killed it before it had a chance to be implemented. The Sub-Treasury would come back the following presidency under James Polk, and it would actually sit in effect for about 50 years, Van Buren's Sub-Treasury, but it was a real struggle for him to get it off the ground, certainly under his term. Well, there was one area where Van Buren differed significantly from his predecessor, Andrew Jackson, and this was the topic of Texas. Texas had recently won its freedom, its independence from Mexico, and established itself as a new independent republic. This happened on Jackson's watch, and Jackson really wanted to bring Texas into the American Union, to annex it as a new state, but he couldn't get it done during his presidency, and Van Buren was against the idea. Van Buren was convinced that given that Mexico still didn't recognize Texas as an independent republic, that Mexico would immediately go to war with the United States if the U.S. tried to annex Texas into the Union. And Van Buren was against this. He wasn't necessarily against Texas coming to the United States in the long term, but he wasn't going to pursue it while the issue with Mexico was still hot and at hand, and he refused to go into a transaction like this that he thought meant certain war. And so for the 4 years of the Van Buren administration, Texas would remain as is, an independent republic. Well, Van Buren's policies were not creating great situations for the United States as this economic recession was really taking hold, so he lost seats in both the House and Senate during the midterm elections, still had bare majorities in both houses of Congress in the Democratic camp, but it really was a tepid support for Van Buren, and at this point it was very difficult for him to get really any legislation through. There were very few legislative accomplishments during Van Buren's presidency. During that midterm election year of 1838, Van Buren did take a break, and it was an enjoyable trip back home to New York. He had an opportunity to go see his hometown, the cities where he used to work, but of course it started off as a very political event. The Whigs, the opposition party, had pretty much taken over the state government and some of the city governments, and they refused to meet with this president, even though he was coming home to their home state. When he went to Albany, New York City, the Whigs were nowhere to be found with the politicians in power. Didn't really matter that much to Van Buren because the people came out, hundreds of thousands of them at the different locations combined. They came out in droves and were vastly supportive, and they enjoyed his recalling and his messages and his speeches in Hudson and especially in Kinderhook, his hometown, how much affection he had for growing up in that area and how it helped him mature as he moved on in his life and career. The Albany Argus, a local newspaper from Albany, was on hand for Van Buren's remarks in Kinderhook, and it reflected that his reply was one of the most effective and beautiful addresses I have ever heard. The feeling allusions to the scenes he had passed through from the time he was a youth to the present was such that all hearts were melted, and he himself was almost overcome by the bare repetition of them. A nice scene. And the scene continued in Kinderhook when Van Buren decided to purchase the home of his Old Town friend, Billy Van Ness, and his family. The Van Ness home was now in possession of Martin Van Buren. It was a bit of a mess. It was run down. It needed a major remodel, which Van Buren was looking forward to in his post-presidential years. He would call the home Lindenwald, but that was a project, of course, that was still a couple of years down the road. Presidential travails continued throughout the administration in another major area that was hung over from the Jackson administration, and this was tied to the Indian Removal Act, which gave President Jackson the authority to renegotiate treaties with the Indians and effectively lead them away from the eastern side of the Mississippi to relocate to the western side. And Jackson did a number of things that effectively left the Indians with no choice. Some reluctantly agreed and began to march under Jackson's watch. These what eventually became known as the Trail of Tears, and the ice and rain and storms and cold that they were traversed across the Mississippi and frankly then left for their own devices without any supplies of note in this barren land to the western part of the Mississippi River. This Trail of Tears, where so many died along the way, was continued consistently by his successor, Martin Van Buren. The Cherokees were mainly in the spotlight during the Van Buren administration, and many of them didn't want to go. Even though the treaty said that they were just signed that they would leave and they took some money in return, many of them didn't want to go, but at this point, the government had made its mind up, and Martin Van Buren was going to enforce that policy of forced relocation. If they didn't want to go, the Trail of Tears would not only continue, it would get worse. Some 4,000 Cherokees died on Van Buren's watch, yet he persisted with that policy and was unapologetic about it. He believed in the policy. He wrote later in his memoirs, specifically talking about his time as Secretary of State and Vice President under Andrew Jackson, when these policies were formulated, that they were all aligned around the promotion of the only rational policy, that of removing the Indians beyond the reach of the bad influences inevitable from association and contention with the white men. They believed that the only way to actually save the Indians was to force relocate them. The fact that they did it in such a horrific way with the terrible weather conditions and the horrible lack of supplies, lack of medicine, and the deaths along the way, the end justifying the means apparently in the minds of Martin Van Buren, and yet another low point in a difficult time for the country as the economic deprivations continued while these forced relocations took place as well. So these were the 4 years of travails of the Martin Van Buren presidency. Economic collapse, Trail of Tears, no major legislative results. He was still convinced his policies were right, but the results were far from desirable for the American people, which created a pretty tough road heading into a re-election campaign. But that's the story for another day. That is Martin Van Buren and Presidential Travails from the life of Martin Van Buren. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com. And don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.